Story 1. The first time I went into that old World War II fort, it felt like slipping into a forgotten memory. The day outside was warm, traffic buzzing along the road nearby. But the moment I began climbing the sheer wall to reach the entrance, it felt like leaving the world behind. Everything else disappeared, and the fort seemed to swallow sound whole. The ropes and anchoring points we'd set up with my scout group made the climb possible, but there was still that prickling tension of being caught, and I found myself ducking behind walls whenever a car passed. The fort itself looked innocent from the outside, just a decaying block of concrete, but stepping inside was like stepping underwater. The air itself felt heavier, colder, and the echo of the first footstep I made seemed to last longer than it should have. The tunnel was tight, my shoulders brushed against the rough walls, and I had to hunch over to move at any speed. I posted myself in a side passage to make sure everyone would follow the right route, taking the role of guide. I had gone in ahead of the others just to check that everything was safe, but the longer I waited, the more the stillness of the tunnel pressed on me. There was no sound beyond my own breathing and the faint, almost imperceptible movement of the air through the long corridors. The temperature was steady, just above cold, and there was a faint breeze that tickled my skin. I kept telling myself it was just old air currents, just physics, but my muscles tightened anyway. After a while, I noticed a tiny light bobbing down the hall. At first, I thought maybe one of the scouts had sneaked in with a lighter, but the movement didn't match footsteps. I crouched back into the shadow of my nook and waited, trying to convince myself it was a reflection from somewhere outside, a trick of the angle. But the light came closer, bobbing smoothly, without a sound to announce it. When it disappeared around a corner, I waited, half expecting someone to step out, but no one came. The silence returned, heavier than before, and I became hyper-aware of every breath I took. Minutes later, a faint scuffling reached my ears. It was subtle, like someone dragging their feet in loose dirt, mixed with soft exhalations that smelled faintly earthy and metallic. I froze, trying not to breathe too heavily, and then I realized something was directly in front of me. The air felt wet and warm, with a faint, human-like smell of sweat and soil. For a moment, whatever it was, and I seemed to be in some kind of standoff, both waiting, both aware of each other's presence. It was impossible to tell if it was a person or something else, but the tension was immediate and very physical, pressing against my chest and ribs. The feeling passed slowly, the wet warmth sliding away, as if whatever it was had decided I wasn't a threat, or maybe it had decided I was. I waited longer, trying to rationalize. Could it have been an animal? A hallucination from holding my breath too long? Something shifting in the walls? Nothing quite explained it. Then a faint light appeared from my right side, like a candle or a small torch, and it moved along the corridor before fading completely, leaving only the cold and silence. I told myself it was probably one of my scouts using a hidden light, though no one was supposed to carry one. Eventually, I heard the unmistakable stomp of boots on concrete coming down the hall from my left. I guided the figure along the passage, careful not to say too much aloud, making sure they took the first right turn when it came. After the whole group had passed, curiosity got the better of me, and I asked who had gone in first. No one claimed to have done so. Even writing this now, I can't fully explain it. There are all kinds of rational possibilities. Another person sneaking in, some trick of the light, the way sound echoes in old tunnels. But none of them feel quite right. That moment in the fort, frozen with something inches from my face, felt like the place itself was alive, aware of me. Whatever it was, it left no trace except the memory of that wet warmth, the faint light, and the echo of boots that didn't seem to belong to anyone I knew. Story 2. I've always had a thing for abandoned places, like they carry a memory in the dust and broken windows, whispering things you're not supposed to hear. There was this old school near my neighborhood that everyone avoided. The paint had peeled off like old scabs, and all the windows were either shattered or nailed shut. One afternoon, I decided to sneak in by myself, climbing up a rusty pipe that ran along the side of the building, using it like a ladder to reach a window on the roof. The whole building smelled like mildew and wet wood, a mix that immediately set my nerves on edge. The stairwell leading down from the roof creaked under my weight, and when I reached the basement, the the stairs disappeared into a shallow pool of water that had collected over the years. The reflection of the dim light from the cracked boards above made everything shimmer in a strange, almost alive way. I moved slowly, each step careful, trying not to make too much noise, but even the faintest drip of water echoed loudly. As I was exploring the gym area, I thought I heard something moving on the other side of the large doors. At first, I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe some animal hiding inside. But the sound of footsteps, one set, deliberate, pacing slowly, made me freeze. The only exit back to the roof was through the same stairwell I had just descended, so I couldn't just leave without facing whatever was there. I waited, listening, trying to convince myself that it was nothing, but the stopping and starting of the footsteps made it impossible to ignore. I decided to edge across the gym, keeping low, and peek down the hallway leading away from me. There was nothing visible, just the dull shadows stretching along the walls. Halfway down the hall toward the stairs, I heard someone, or something, sprinting behind me. The sound was quick and heavy, bouncing off the high school hallways in a way that made my stomach turn. I tried to see if there was anyone there in the little slivers of light coming through the cracked boards, but there was nothing. It was like the noise had a source, but that source wasn't tangible. My instincts screamed at me to run, so I bolted up the stairs, my legs shaking, the echoes of the footsteps chasing me in my head. When I finally reached the fourth floor, I pressed myself against the wall, trying to catch my breath and listen for any sound of pursuit. The silence was almost worse than the noise itself. It felt heavy and unnatural, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Eventually, I climbed out through the window and down the pipe, my heart still racing. Even after I was outside and back in the fresh air, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been following me. Something that had no right to exist but left undeniable traces. I've gone back during the day to look at the building, tried to rationalize it as my imagination, echoing footsteps, or even a neighbor walking around. But everything lines up too perfectly. The way the sounds moved, the timing, the way the light played tricks on me. It's possible it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks. But I'll never forget the way it felt to have invisible eyes on me, following me through an empty, abandoned school. Even now, I avoid that building, and I'm not sure I'll ever be curious enough to go back. Story 3. I always liked exploring forgotten places, the kind of spots that most people walk past without a second thought. That day, the sun was just low enough to cast long shadows through the woods, and the air smelled of wet leaves and dirt. I was wandering alone, following a small creek that cut through the trees, when I noticed a short length of pipe jutting out of a moss-covered hillside. It was almost hidden, but something about it called me closer, like a curiosity I couldn't ignore. I decided to crawl in and see where it led. At first, the pipe was wide enough to move on my hands and knees, but soon it narrowed until I was forced to slide forward on my stomach. The metal walls were slick with moisture, and the faint light from my weak headlamp barely reached more than a few feet ahead. After crawling what felt like forever, I entered a small chamber, the kind of manhole room that hinted at something built above. It was oddly quiet except for the drip of water somewhere in the distance, and I got the strange impression that I might be underneath a house, though there was no sign of one above. From there, tiny offshoots extended into darker corners, narrow enough that I could barely squeeze through. I chose one and pressed on. A few hundred feet in, the air changed. There was a weight in the pipe, something that hadn't been there before. At first, I thought it was just debris, maybe an animal that had crawled in and died. But as I inched closer, I realized it was something else entirely. I crawled over it, feeling it with my hands, and the texture was wrong. Rough, almost like a mix of fur and something else, damp and heavy. My stomach twisted at the smell. It was sour, acidic, like something had been rotting for days. My headlamp flickered slightly, but the darkness swallowed everything beyond its beam. I tried to convince myself it was just a dead animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog, but every instinct in me told me otherwise. I kept moving forward, though each inch felt like a small victory against the growing sense of dread. The pipe continued to shrink, forcing me further onto my stomach, and the stench ahead intensified. Then I noticed subtle things I hadn't seen before. Scratches on the metal walls like someone or something had clawed at it. Tiny footprints pressed into the damp earth suggested I wasn't the first to crawl here. My heart raced, but I reasoned it could be other explorers, vandals, or animals. Still, the place had a feeling of being watched. It wasn't paranoia at first, more like a physical weight pressing on my back, urging me to turn around. Further along, I came to another pile in the pipe. It was bigger this time, almost blocking the way entirely. I couldn't tell what it was from the weak light, but the smell was unbearable, acrid, almost chemical. My stomach rolled, and I wondered if I should just leave. Curiosity pushed me onward. I slowly slid over the obstruction, feeling it shift slightly under my weight, and for a brief moment, it moved in a way that seemed deliberate, not like a pile of trash or an animal. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, half expecting to hear something whisper or scuttle behind me. The silence persisted, heavy and unnatural. I pushed forward a few more 100 feet, and then I noticed the unmistakable smell of something wet and foul ahead, stronger than before, almost choking. My heart hammered as the beam from my headlamp caught shapes in the corner of my vision. Shapes that shouldn't have been there, but there was nothing when I looked directly at them. My body tensed, the hairs on my arms standing up. Whatever was ahead didn't seem alive in the normal sense, but it wasn't exactly inert either. The air itself seemed heavier, charged with something I couldn't name. I thought about turning back, but I had committed too far. Step by step, inch by inch, I pressed on. Finally, I reached a larger obstruction, something that seemed impossibly large for the narrow pipe. I froze again, trying to catch my breath, and saw shadows shift slightly, like the pile itself was breathing. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Maybe a bundle of trash, maybe a large animal, but the shape didn't match anything I knew. I scrambled backward, my stomach churning, and didn't stop until I had returned to the small chamber. I forced myself to climb out, the cool daylight hitting my face like a shock. The world outside looked ordinary, the woods quiet, but the feeling of eyes following me lingered. When I inspected the mess of my clothes, I found dark, wet patches that smelled like iron and decay. The material wasn't animal fur, at least not any I recognized. It was tangled, coarse, and strangely uniform, almost like a dark fabric. I washed it off as best I could, but a part of me kept glancing back at the hillside, wondering what else might have been down there. I haven't gone back since, and I don't think I ever will. Part of me wants to believe there's a simple explanation, but another part of me can't shake the feeling that I touched something not meant for human hands, something ancient and patient, waiting deep in the dark. Story 4. The first time I ever got genuinely spooked, it wasn't in some dark forest or haunted house. It was in a place I thought I knew like the back of my hand, an old airbase on the outskirts of my hometown. The cracked tarmac and abandoned hangars looked harmless enough in daylight, like an old dog lazing in the sun. But there was something about the deserted spaces that made them feel alive in a way I couldn't name. My curiosity led me to a half-torn-down school sitting near the edge of the base, the kind of building that looked like it had been left in a hurry, papers and plaster scattered like breadcrumbs for anyone brave or foolish enough to follow. I had gone in during the day before, just to poke around, and found the usual teenage graffiti, crude scribbles cursing God or praising serial killers, that sort of stuff. It was juvenile and dumb, but it had this energy, a kind of tension in the air that made my skin crawl just a little. There were holes in the floor that led down into the basement, and at the bottom, water pooled just above ankle height, shimmering like dirty mercury in the daylight. I told myself I would come back at night, but even thinking about it made my stomach twist in ways I didn't fully understand. When I finally returned after dark, I parked a few 100 feet away and sat in my car, trying to psych myself up. The night felt heavy, almost sticky, and the shadows seemed to crawl across the cracked concrete in ways that didn't match the streetlights. As I got out to make my approach, I noticed a truck sliding into the empty lot, a faded early 90s blue Ford with a gun rack in the back. The headlights cut swaths of bright light through the darkness, making it impossible to tell if anyone was inside. I felt my heart kick up, a dry, fluttering panic, and I thought I saw the driver glance in my direction. My instinct told me to leave immediately. I got back in my car, trying to look casual, and as I pulled away, the truck started following. At first, it stayed a few car lengths behind, but soon it was tailing me closely, then cutting its lights completely only to hit the high beams a moment later, as if it was playing a game of shadows with me. I tried to convince myself it was some bored local wandering the airbase, but it didn't make sense. I was the only car out there, and the place had been abandoned for years. The strange game went on for half an hour. Every time I slowed down, it slowed. Every time I turned, it mirrored me. At some points, I thought I saw movement in the truck, like someone leaning over the passenger seat, but the details were always fuzzy, obscured by the dark and the glare of the headlights. I considered calling the cops, but something about the silence and emptiness of the base made me hesitate. My phone felt almost too fragile in my hands, like a small thing that could be ripped from reality at any second. I eventually reached the main gate, and the truck stopped following, sitting in the shadows as if it had been nothing more than a figment of my imagination. I still go back to the school sometimes, but only during the day. There's a lingering sense that whatever followed me that night wasn't entirely human, or at least not behaving like one. People have suggested it was a prankster or someone using a cheap trick, maybe even a hallucination from anxiety. But I remember the way the shadows bent and shifted, the way the lot felt alive under the glow of the truck's headlights. And I'm not entirely convinced there's a fully rational explanation. Sometimes when I drive past that lot at night, I feel that same tug of unease, a reminder that the world might have corners we don't fully understand, and some of them can find us when we least expect it. Story 5. You know how some places feel heavy before you even see them? Like the air itself remembers what happened there. That's what this old quarry felt like. The kind of place that hums quietly under your skin, even when everything's still. I went there once by myself early spring, after hearing some local hikers mention the tunnels carved deep into the side of the mountain. I'd been exploring abandoned places for a while. Old factories, storm drains, rail tunnels. Mostly for the thrill and the strange calm you get from standing somewhere forgotten. This quarry was different, though. From the entrance, it looked like a wide mouth opening into the mountain, swallowing up whatever dared to step inside. The first part of the tunnel wasn't too bad. My flashlight cut through dust that floated like tiny bits of ash. Every sound I made, the crunch of gravel, my breathing, bounced back at me from the stone walls. The deeper I went, the colder it got. I passed old metal rails and rusted carts, maybe from when they hauled rock out decades ago. Water dripped steadily somewhere in the dark, echoing in that slow, hypnotic rhythm tunnels seem to have. About 20 minutes in, the main passage split into smaller tunnels, some caved in, some leading into larger open spaces. I marked my turns with chalk because I'd read too many stories about people getting lost underground. Eventually, I reached a clearing, a large chamber with part of the ceiling collapsed. Half of it was flooded, and a thin layer of mist hovered over the surface of the water. My flashlight beam caught something sitting half submerged near the rocks, an old television. It was one of those bulky cabinet-style TVs, the kind that weighed as much as furniture. I remember thinking how strange it was for it to be there. There was no way anyone could have carried that thing so deep underground unless it was years ago. I stood there trying to figure out if someone had been using the quarry as some kind of hideout. Then I noticed the screen. It was facing slightly upward, cracked and coated in grime, but the glass reflected light weirdly. My flashlight beam flickered for a second, like the battery was dying, and in that half second of dim light, I swear the screen seemed to pulse faintly. Not glow, not light up. More like it caught light that wasn't mine. I stood perfectly still, waiting to see if it would happen again. Nothing. Just the sound of dripping water and the distant creak of shifting rock. I started feeling uneasy, not scared exactly, just off. You know that feeling when a place suddenly feels too aware of you? I backed up a few steps and scanned the walls. The mist had thickened over the water, curling toward the TV. It almost looked like it was being drawn to it. Then from somewhere behind me came a sharp splash, like someone had dropped a stone into the water. I turned fast, light shaking across the flooded floor, but there was no one there. The ripples spread out slow, fading into stillness again. The tunnel behind me was empty. When I turned the light back toward the TV, it had shifted slightly. Not much, but enough for the angle to change. The base had left a clean mark in the dirt where it used to sit. I told myself maybe I'd just seen it wrong at first, or maybe the ground underneath was soft, but the part of me that likes logic wasn't winning that argument. I remember the air suddenly getting colder, sharp enough that my breath showed. I heard a faint buzzing then, that old electrical hum TVs used to make when they were on, except this one was clearly dead. The sound didn't echo like everything else did in that place. It just hung there, close to my ears. I started walking back slowly, flashlight shaking a bit, trying to convince myself I'd been down there too long, that my brain was just filling in things that weren't there. But as I turned back one last time, I saw the reflection of light again. Not from my flashlight, but from the TV screen. It looked like static, faint and gray, like a snowstorm flickering on the glass. That was enough for me. I didn't run, but I didn't stop to look again either. I followed my chalk marks all the way back until I saw daylight leaking through the main tunnel. By the time I reached my car, the sound of dripping water was still echoing in my ears. A week later, I went back with a friend, partly to prove to myself it wasn't what I thought it was. The tunnel was the same, the water was still there, but the TV was gone. There wasn't even a mark where it had sat, just rocks and a thin film of mud. My friend said maybe someone else had dragged it out, maybe scrap collectors or other explorers. I wanted to believe that, but sometimes when I think about it, I remember that faint static hum that didn't echo, like it wasn't part of the cave's sound at all. Just its own thing, waiting to be heard again. Story 6. There's something about tunnels that messes with your sense of direction and time. The air feels thick, like it's holding its breath, and every sound stretches longer than it should. I used to love that kind of silence, the kind that hums just below hearing, making you aware of every small movement your body makes. Back when I was into urban exploration, I'd gone through disused hospitals, air raid shelters, even an old Cold War bunker once. They all had a certain mood, but nothing like the storm drains beneath London. That night I went alone. I'd been there before with a few mates, but it was always better solo. Less noise, fewer distractions. You could actually feel the place then. The drains are mostly dry, wide concrete tunnels stretching for miles, some connecting to bigger chambers where runoff gathers. I always brought my headlamp, a small flashlight, extra batteries, and a carbon mask in case of stale air. The rule of thumb was to stay alert for water sounds or shifts in pressure. A sudden draft or temperature drop could mean something changed somewhere upstream, like rain or someone dumping water into the system. I'd been walking for maybe 40 minutes, maybe more, hard to tell. The tunnel curved gently left, then right, like a snake winding through the earth. My light cut across graffiti and dripping pipes, illuminating old marks from when the city still used these drains actively. It was peaceful in a weird way, just the echo of my boots and the slow rhythm of distant dripping water. Then the air started to feel heavy. It was subtle at first, like the pressure in a plane before takeoff. I stopped and waited, listening. There was no sound except the quiet hiss of my own breathing. Then came the gust. It wasn't a gentle breeze. It was like something enormous had just exhaled from deep inside the tunnel. The wind came rushing toward me, cold and sudden, carrying a faint smell I can't really describe. Metallic, maybe, but not quite. My flashlight flickered as if the air itself had stolen power from it. I turned back instinctively, thinking maybe there'd been a pressure dump somewhere behind me, but there was nothing. Just darkness stretching out both ways. That's when the feeling hit. It wasn't fear at first, more like an instinct, the same kind that makes animals scatter before a storm. My body knew something before my brain could explain it. I remember thinking, that's not right. The air shouldn't move like that down there unless there's a massive shift somewhere. But the weather had been calm, dry, no storms. I started walking back the way I came, picking up speed. My light flickered again, dimming for half a second before returning. I tried to tell myself it was just condensation on the battery connection. Then I noticed the temperature. It had dropped sharply. My breath started to fog in the beam of my lamp. That shouldn't happen underground, not at that depth. The drains usually stay a constant temperature, maybe a little cool, but never that cold. I walked faster. My footsteps echoed harder than before, like something was matching them a few beats behind. I stopped once, completely still, and listened. The echo stopped too. But when I started walking again, I could have sworn I heard a faint scuff, just slightly out of sync. I told myself it was just water shifting, maybe some airflow messing with acoustics. But when you're deep underground, your brain doesn't listen to logic anymore. It listens to survival. Every instinct screamed to move, and so I did. As I neared one of the maintenance ladders leading up to a manhole, another gust blew through. This one warm, oddly warm, like someone had just opened an oven door behind me. It carried a low hum, almost a vibration, that passed through the walls and into my chest. I froze, staring back into the dark, but saw nothing except the dim glow of my light reflecting off wet concrete. That was enough. I climbed. I don't even remember my hands touching the rungs, just the sound of metal scraping under my gloves and my own heartbeat in my ears. When I reached the top and pushed open the cover, the night air outside hit me like a shock. It was calm, dry, quiet, no storm, no wind, nothing. I sat there for a while trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was just a sudden air pressure change or some underground machinery starting up somewhere else in the system. That's what I told myself. But the way the temperature shifted, the way the air felt, it didn't add up. I'd been in tunnels for years and nothing like that had ever happened before or since. Sometimes I think about that warm gust, how it came after the cold one, how it felt almost like two different breaths, one pulling me deeper, one pushing me out. Maybe it was just physics, maybe not. Either way, I've never gone back down there alone again. Story 7. I've always liked exploring abandoned places. There's something strange about walking through the remains of what used to be alive with people. It's like time froze, and you're sneaking around in someone else's forgotten dream. That's what drew me to the old Northville Asylum in Michigan. It's been shut down for decades, a whole complex of crumbling red brick buildings, half swallowed by weeds, with underground tunnels connecting everything like veins. The first couple of times I went, it was more like a curiosity than anything creepy. But the third time, that one changed how I feel about dark places forever. The first 2 visits went almost like field trips. I met other explorers, teenagers with spray paint, a pair of older guys who used to work maintenance there back in the 70s. They told me stories about the hospital's shutdown, how equipment and patient files were just left behind. It was eerie, sure, but not terrifying. You'd walk into a patient room and see a dusty mattress, a clipboard with faded writing, sometimes a jar still sitting on a shelf. The air always had this stale chemical smell that clung to your clothes for hours afterward. On my 3rd visit, I went alone. It wasn't the smartest thing I've ever done, but I wanted to see the main tower, the tall 18-story structure that used to be the administration building. You can see Detroit from the top, I'd heard, and I wanted to check that view for myself. It was a cold night in early fall, and the clouds were low enough to hide the moon, so the only light came from my flashlight. The silence hit me right after I slipped through the same broken window I'd used before. No voices, no cars on the nearby road, just the wind pushing through cracked panes and the steady drip of water somewhere deep in the hall. I started on the ground floor, moving slowly through corridors lined with peeling paint that curled off the walls like old skin. The place felt tighter than before, even though it hadn't changed. Every sound bounced back. My steps, the beam of my light flicking across metal doors, the faint thud when something dropped in another wing. It's hard to describe how sound travels in a place like that. Sometimes it feels like you're walking toward an echo that's moving away from you. Eventually, I found the stairwell that led to the tower. The stairwell was narrow, with concrete steps worn smooth in the middle. I remember counting floors for a while, but losing track after 10. The higher I went, the colder it got, and the air began to smell like rust. About 2/3 up, I paused to catch my breath and noticed something odd. It felt like someone else was climbing with me. Every time I stopped, I'd hear one extra step echo after mine. Just one. I tried to tell myself it was the sound bouncing around the stairwell, delayed somehow, but the timing didn't match. My heart started pounding harder than the climb deserved. I kept going, mostly because going down suddenly felt worse than continuing up. Around the 17th floor, I stopped again. That's when I heard it clearly. Footsteps above me. Not echoes. Actual, slow, deliberate steps, moving back and forth directly overhead. The sound was distinct enough that I could picture the floorboards flexing under weight. For a long moment, I just stood there, frozen halfway up the steps, trying to make sense of it. There shouldn't have been anyone up there. The building was locked from every entrance except the one I broke through. I thought about calling out, but the idea died as soon as it came. Something about that steady pacing made my stomach drop. Whoever, or whatever, was up there, they weren't just walking, they were waiting. I switched off my flashlight and held my breath. The footsteps didn't stop. They kept crossing from one end of the top floor to the other, pausing occasionally, then starting again. I tried to believe it was wind-moving debris, maybe something loose rolling around, but there was rhythm to it. Heel, toe, and the way it shifted direction felt too intentional. After about a minute of standing there, the sound suddenly stopped. The silence was thick enough that I could hear my pulse in my ears. I started backing down the stairs, one careful step at a time. When I hit the landing of the 16th floor, something scraped against the concrete above, like a shoe turning. Then faintly, I heard a single step descend. Just one. That was enough. I didn't bother to be quiet anymore. I ran. My flashlight bounced wildly, catching glimpses of graffiti and open doors as I tore down flight after flight. The sound of my own running filled the stairwell, but I swear I heard something behind me. Not running, just walking, matching my descent at its own pace. By the time I reached the main hallway, I was gasping. The building seemed to close in from all sides. The corridors darker than before, like the light from my flashlight wasn't strong enough anymore. I sprinted toward the exit, slammed my shoulder through the broken window, and hit the cold air outside. I didn't stop running until I reached the road. When I finally looked back, the asylum stood there like a black silhouette against the sky. Every window was dark, except one near the top of the tower. It glowed faintly, like someone had just switched on a light. I never went back after that. I still don't know what I heard. Maybe another explorer, maybe a squatter, maybe the building itself settling. But sometimes when I think about that extra step echoing after mine, I wonder if the asylum was as empty as I believed. Story 8. Something is unsettling about empty houses, especially the ones that still feel like someone's supposed to be living there. I remember thinking that the moment I stepped into that biker gang house, it was mid-afternoon, sunlight cutting through dirty blinds, making strips of dust hang in the air like ghosts. My job was simple. Walk through, measure the damage, write the report for the insurance company. I'd done it 100 times before, but this one, something about it didn't sit right. The place had been seized by the police a few months prior. You could still see the traces of what it once was. A rough crowd's den, stickers half scraped off doors, a faint smell of beer and gasoline mixed with disinfectant. Every wall had been painted white, thick coats that didn't match in shade, like they were covering something. The floor was all plywood sheets, painted dark red. I assumed it was just some biker aesthetic thing, but the more I looked at it, the less it felt like a design choice and more like an attempt to hide something. The silence in there was heavy. Even my boots on the wood sounded wrong, too hollow, too sharp. I started with the living room, jotting down measurements. The windows were boarded from the outside, but light still squeezed in through cracks. The air smelled faintly metallic, like rust or something else. Every room was the same. Plain white walls, red floors, nothing inside. No furniture, no curtains, no signs of life, just echoes. Upstairs, the hallway was narrow and felt longer than it should have been. Doors on each side, all closed. I opened them one by one. Bedrooms, bathroom, small office. Everything stripped bare. I told myself it was fine, just another job, but my skin was prickling. Something about the stillness made me uneasy, like the house was waiting for something. The last door was a small one at the end of the hall. It didn't look like a regular room door, more like a closet. I remember thinking it was strange how freshly the paint looked around the handle, as if someone had gone over it again and again. I turned the knob and pulled it open. At first, I thought it was just a linen closet. It was empty except for the smell. Sharp, musty, like old water trapped in wood. But then I saw the inside of the door. It was covered in deep scratches. Not light ones either. These were thick, gouged lines, layered over each other, clawed into the wood with such force that small splinters hung loose. The dents were on the other side of the door too, like something had been pounding from the inside, trying to get out. I froze, staring. It wasn't just the scratches, it was what was behind them. The back wall of the closet had a circular mark, faint but visible through the uneven white paint. A splatter pattern. Red underneath, covered badly with a fresh coat. I don't know why, but the shape of it, it looked deliberate. It wasn't random. My chest tightened. I told myself it was old paint, maybe from before the renovation. But the pattern, it was too organic. I leaned closer and the faint smell of copper hit me. My eyes started to sting a little from the chemicals or maybe from nerves, I don't know. The hallway light flickered behind me. I told myself it was just bad wiring, old house stuff. But when I turned, the light steadied again. That was when I noticed how quiet it had gotten. No creaks, no distant sounds from outside. Nothing. The kind of silence that hums in your ears. I took one last photo for the report and shut the closet door quickly. The moment it clicked shut, I heard something. A soft tap from inside. I froze again, hands still on the doorknob. It wasn't loud, just a small, deliberate sound, like a finger brushing wood. I stood there holding my breath, waiting. Another tap, then silence. I told myself it was the house settling, maybe a loose pipe knocking behind the wall. But when I stepped back, I noticed something I hadn't before. There was a faint mark on the floor right outside the closet door, like something heavy had been dragged across the plywood, leaving shallow grooves that led into the hallway. I followed them with my flashlight, but they faded halfway down. I left after that. Didn't finish measuring the basement, didn't double-check the other rooms, just packed up my stuff, locked the door behind me, and sat in my car for a while. The air outside felt too clean, too light after being in there. When I wrote the report later that evening, I mentioned the structural damage, the paint job, and the odd smell. I didn't mention the closet. I told myself it wasn't relevant. But that night, I kept thinking about those scratches, the direction of them, the dents on the inside, not the outside. Someone had been locked in that closet. That much seemed clear. What didn't make sense was the pattern on the wall behind it, painted over in a rush. The red was still bleeding through the white paint like it wanted to be seen. Now and then, when I think back on that day, I remember the faint tap that came from behind the door. I've told myself 100 times that it was nothing, that houses make noises, wood shifts, pipes rattle, but I know the sound wood makes when it settles. That wasn't it. Story 9. You can tell when a building has seen too many years. It breathes differently. The air feels older, heavier, like it's carrying whispers you're not supposed to hear. That's exactly how the basement of my old public school felt. I used to walk those halls as a kid, and back then, the basement was off limits. Teachers always said it was for storage and maintenance. Years later, when I ended up working for a fire inspection company, I finally got to see what was really down there. I wish I hadn't. It was the summer before the new school year, and I was assigned to inspect the fire systems across all the schools in the district. Maple Hill Elementary was the oldest, built in the late 1800s, patched up over decades but never really modernized. The place smelled like chalk, wet concrete, and nostalgia. I'd been looking forward to going back, just to see how it felt being there again. Everything was routine until I got to the boiler room in the basement. It was smaller than I remembered and colder, even though it was the middle of July. My flashlight beam skimmed over pipes, broken chairs, and boxes filled with outdated books. That's when I noticed something strange. Behind a heavy metal shelving unit, pushed against the far wall, there was a dark gap, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Curiosity got the better of me. I moved the shelf a few inches and revealed what looked like a narrow concrete corridor. The air pouring out from it was cold and stale, and it smelled faintly of dirt and rust. I figured it was just an access tunnel, maybe for utilities or maintenance. I hesitated but decided to check it out. After all, I was there to inspect the building. The tunnel sloped slightly downward. The walls were rough concrete, damp in places, and the overhead light pipes rattled quietly every few seconds. My flashlight flickered, which didn't help. The further I walked, the less I heard from the building above. No humming lights, no echo of footsteps, just the dull sound of my boots scraping on concrete. After maybe 30 meters, I found old planks, rusted tools, and what looked like construction debris scattered along the sides. There was also an old barrel with graffiti on it. Someone had painted a crude pair of eyes staring out. For some reason, that part made my chest tighten. The paint had faded and peeled, but the eyes still looked angry, almost watchful. The tunnel kept going, straight and narrow. I tried to convince myself I'd stop once I reached the next turn or door, but there wasn't one. It just kept stretching forward, the beam of my flashlight never reaching the end. I started to get this feeling, like the air behind me was changing, pressing closer somehow. I turned around, expecting to see the faint light from the boiler room door. It wasn't there, just black. I told myself I must have gone further than I thought, maybe 50 meters in, and the light couldn't reach that far. Still, something about how dark it was didn't feel right. My flashlight started to buzz faintly, then dim. The battery indicator had been full earlier. I gave it a shake, and the beam steadied. But now I noticed something else. Faint scuff marks on the ground ahead of me. They weren't shoe prints, more like drag marks, uneven and long, as if someone had been pulling something heavy. They ran along the center of the tunnel, going deeper into the dark. I crouched down to look closer and realized some of the grooves had what looked like faint scrape lines on either side, almost symmetrical, like handprints, or something that had claws. That was enough to make me uneasy. I stood up fast, tried to laugh it off, and said out loud that it was probably old maintenance equipment being dragged years ago. But my voice didn't echo back, not even a little. I hadn't noticed until that moment that there was no echo at all in the tunnel. The air swallowed every sound whole. I decided to head back. I turned around and started walking faster than before. Every step echoed in my head, even if it didn't in the tunnel. I kept the flashlight aimed at the floor to avoid tripping, but something made me lift it once. And that's when I saw it. About 20 feet ahead, where the tunnel should have ended in solid black, there was a faint shimmer of movement. Just a darker shadow among shadows, standing still. I froze. The light caught on something like a shoulder, then nothing. The beam dimmed again, and the shape was gone. My stomach dropped. I didn't think. I just ran. I ran hard, arms brushing against the walls, not caring about noise anymore. I just wanted out. But the tunnel felt longer now, much longer than when I came in. My flashlight went completely dead halfway through, and I had to feel along the wall, breathing hard, my heart hammering in my ears. Every few seconds, I swore I heard something faint, like dragging steps behind me, matching my pace. I finally saw a faint rectangle of light ahead, the gap behind the shelf. I nearly tripped trying to squeeze through it. When I stumbled back into the boiler room, the sound of the humming lights returned all at once, like I'd been underwater and had finally surfaced. I pushed the shelf back against the wall immediately, harder than I needed to. I didn't want anyone else finding that tunnel. When my supervisor asked later why I didn't finish checking the basement circuits, I said the area was sealed off. He didn't question it. A few weeks later, out of curiosity, I checked the school's blueprints. The tunnel wasn't marked anywhere. No mention of it in any maintenance plans either. I even asked an older janitor who'd worked there for decades if he knew about it. He told me there used to be an old access passage during the war years, maybe leading to a storage area, but he thought it was sealed up long ago. Story 10. I've always had a fascination with abandoned places, the kind that look frozen in time, like someone hit pause and walked away decades ago. A few years back, I got curious about Strathmartine Hospital in Dundee. The place was massive, and I'd heard it used to house all sorts of people. Unwed mothers, troubled kids, and anyone society didn't quite know what to do with. After the hospitals were closed in the early 90s, most of the land got sold off for flats, but this one section never went anywhere. I managed to sneak in alone one chilly evening, drawn by the eerie quiet that seemed to swallow the entire building. The fences were rusted, the gates half open, and the place smelled faintly of old wood and cleaning chemicals that had soaked into the floors decades ago. Once inside, it felt like stepping into a museum nobody knew existed. Beds were still made, furniture arranged as if someone might return any moment. I wandered down a corridor lined with peeling wallpaper, passing communal bathrooms where rusted taps reflected the dim light from broken windows. The gym had weights scattered on the floor, and the pool was drained, the tiles cracked and greened with algae. I moved cautiously, noticing the children's ward off to the side. Colorful drawings still clung to the walls, fading but unmistakable reminders of lives lived long ago. I felt an odd heaviness in the air, like someone was watching, just out of sight. But the hallways were completely empty. As I stepped into one of the L-shaped wings, I caught the faintest hint of a whistle, just at the edge of hearing, and it made me freeze. The sound seemed to circle around me, echoing off walls in a way that made it impossible to tell where it was coming from. My heart started beating faster, and I remembered the stories of security occasionally patrolling, though the place had been abandoned for years. I hugged the wall, moving slowly, and then footsteps joined the whistle. They weren't synchronized with mine, not matching the way I moved. I ducked behind a doorway, peeking around the edge, expecting to see a guard or another trespasser, but the hallway was empty. I stayed crouched for what felt like minutes, but when I dared to look again, there was no one. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, an animal in the ceiling, or my own imagination messing with the shadows. Still, every time I turned a corner, the air seemed heavier, like walking through invisible curtains. Some doors were slightly ajar, even though they looked firmly closed before, and the creaking floorboards sounded under weight that wasn't mine. In one room, the medication cabinets were still stocked with pill bottles, some toppled, some upright, and the old health posters hung crookedly. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows flitting where the light couldn't reach. But when I turned fully, there was nothing. The final moment came when I stepped into the children's ward. The room was smaller, brighter from the dying sunlight outside. I felt an intense pressure in my chest and a sharp anxiety that made my hands shake. I remembered reading somewhere about people sensing residual energy in places like this, so I told myself it was probably just nerves. But as I raised my camera to film a bit, the playback later would reveal something I couldn't explain. At the exact moment I felt the presence, the footage stuttered and warped, like the magnetic field or something had been disrupted. The whistling seemed to be on the tape too, faint but undeniable, layered under the sound of my own breathing. I ran after that, sprinting through the corridors until I was back outside, gasping in the cold evening air. Part of me wants to rationalize it all, chalk it up to my imagination, or the building settling in ways that made the sounds bounce strangely. Another part knows exactly what I felt in that children's ward. The weight of eyes that weren't there, the faint whistle that didn't belong to any living person. I still wonder if it was just a lonely place echoing its own history, or something else lingering in the air decades after everyone else had gone.